In a land where survival depends on grit, one man's unexpected offer could change two lonely lives forever. But pride and loss can be powerful walls to break. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The harsh winter wind howled through the pine trees surrounding the small frontier town of Timberline, Colorado. The year was 1883, and life in the Rocky Mountains demanded resilience from those who called it home. Thomas Fletcher, a broad-shouldered lumberjack with weathered hands and kind eyes, stood at the window of his modest cabin, watching snowflakes dance in the dim light of dawn. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the crackling fire. His daughter, just 9 years old, lay sleeping in her small bed across the room. Her mother had passed away during a fever that swept through the town 3 years prior, leaving Thomas to raise their child alone. The life of a widower and father wasn't easy, especially in these remote parts. Thomas ran a hand through his thick brown beard, streaked with premature gray. At 35, he had become the foreman at the local lumber mill, respected for his work ethic and strength. Yet each evening, he returned to a home that felt incomplete. "Pa?" Sarah's sleepy voice called from beneath her quilts. "Is it morning already?" Thomas turned from the window, his stern face softening. "Indeed it is, little one. The snow's coming down something fierce today." Sarah pushed herself up, her blonde hair tangled from sleep. "Will we still go to town? You promised we could visit Mr. Peterson's store." "I did promise, didn't I?" Thomas smiled, moving to stoke the fire. "And a Fletcher always keeps their word. But first, breakfast and chores." As they shared a simple meal of cornmeal porridge, Thomas contemplated the day ahead. Saturdays were precious. No work at the mill meant time with Sarah. These moments kept him going through the long, lonely nights. "Pa," Sarah said, pushing her empty bowl away, "Jenny at school says her ma makes her a new dress every season." "Do you think?" Thomas sighed, guilt washing over him. "I'm not much for sewing, Sarah. Your ma was the one with that talent." "I know," Sarah replied, eyes downcast. "I just thought maybe." "Tell you what," Thomas said quickly. "We'll see if Mrs. Wilson might help. She's been kind enough to mend your clothes before." After bundling up against the cold, they hitched their sturdy horse to the small wagon and made their way down the snow-covered trail toward town. Thomas noticed how Sarah had grown in recent months, her questions becoming more complex, her needs expanding beyond what his rough hands could provide. Timberline came into view, a collection of wooden buildings, smoke rising from chimneys, the church steeple standing tallest among them. As they approached the general store, Thomas noticed an unfamiliar wagon outside. "Looks like we have visitors to town," he remarked, helping Sarah down from their wagon. Inside the store, the warmth and familiar scent of coffee, leather, and dried goods greeted them. Mr. Peterson, the shopkeeper, was engaged in conversation with a woman Thomas had never seen before. Beside her stood a young girl, perhaps 5 years old, clutching a small rag doll. "Ah, Thomas. Good morning to you," Mr. Peterson called out. "Meet our newest neighbors. This is Mrs. Eleanor Hartford and her daughter Lily. They've just arrived from Boston to take over the old Harper place." Thomas removed his hat respectfully. "Ma'am," he nodded. "Welcome to Timberline." Eleanor Hartford stood straight-backed, her dark hair neatly pinned beneath a modest bonnet. Despite the simplicity of her traveling clothes, there was an unmistakable refinement to her bearing. "Thank you, Mr. Fletcher. It's a pleasure to meet a fellow resident. Mrs. Hartford's husband passed last spring," Mr. Peterson explained in a hushed tone. "She's come west for a fresh start." Thomas recognized the look in her eyes, the same quiet determination he'd had to find after losing his wife. "It's a good place for new beginnings, ma'am, though the winters take some getting used to." Sarah, meanwhile, had approached the younger girl. "I'm Sarah. I'm 9. Do you want to see what candies Mr. Peterson has?" Little Lily looked up at her mother questioningly. Eleanor nodded with a gentle smile. "Go ahead, dear. Stay where I can see you." As the children moved to the glass jars of colorful sweets, Thomas found himself studying Mrs. Hartford. There was strength in her delicate features, a resilience born of hardship. "The Harper place needs considerable work," Thomas said conversationally. "Been empty these past 2 years." "So I've discovered," Eleanor replied with a slight laugh. "The roof leaks in at least 3 places, and the door doesn't quite close properly. Winter's no time for a lady and child to be tackling such repairs," Thomas found himself saying. "The men from town often help newcomers get settled. I'd be happy to have a look at that roof when the snow lets up." Something flickered in Eleanor's eyes, pride, perhaps, or wariness. "That's very kind, Mr. Fletcher, but I wouldn't want to impose." "No imposition, ma'am. It's how we survive out here, helping one another." Their conversation was interrupted by Sarah and Lily returning, the younger girl now smiling shyly. "Pa, can Lily come play at our house sometime? She's never seen a real lumber camp." Thomas glanced at Eleanor, who seemed hesitant. The divide between them was palpable. He, a rough-hewn lumberman with calloused hands. She, clearly from genteel society back east. Yet they shared a common bond of loss and the challenge of raising a child alone. "Perhaps when you're more settled, Mrs. Hartford," Thomas offered. "Our cabin isn't much, but Sarah would be delighted for the company." "Perhaps," Eleanor conceded with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We have much to do before socializing, I'm afraid." As they parted ways, Thomas couldn't help but wonder what circumstances had brought such a refined woman to this rugged frontier town. Whatever her story, he recognized a kindred spirit, someone fighting to build something from the ashes of loss. "She seems sad, Pa," Sarah observed as they loaded their supplies into the wagon. Thomas watched as Eleanor and Lily climbed into their own wagon. "Starting over isn't easy, little one. But folks around here know something about that." The snow was falling harder now, blanketing the town in pristine white. As they headed home, Thomas found his thoughts returning to the widow with the proud bearing and wary eyes. In Timberline, no one survived the winters alone. Sooner or later, everyone learned to accept help, even those who seemed determined to stand apart. The following week brought a bitter, cold snap that froze the creek solid and sent temperatures plummeting across Timberline. At the lumber mill, work slowed as machinery froze and men struggled to keep warm. Thomas spent his days troubleshooting broken equipment and his evenings ensuring the cabin was sealed against the relentless chill. "This cold spell's the worst I've seen in 15 years, declared Bill Hargrove, Thomas's second-in-command at the mill, as they worked to thaw a frozen saw mechanism. "Heard the new widow woman and her little girl are having a rough go of it out at the Harper place." Thomas paused, rag in hand. "What do you mean?" "My wife visited yesterday with some preserves. Says that place is barely habitable, chimneys not drawing right, so it's filled with smoke. Little girl's caught a terrible cough." Bill shook his head. "City folk don't know what they're in for out here." Thomas frowned, remembering Eleanor Hartford's proud demeanor and her reluctance to accept help. "Did your wife offer assistance?" "Course she did," Bill replied, testing the saw blade. "But the widow thanked her kindly and said they'd manage. Proud sort, isn't she?" The conversation stayed with Thomas throughout the day and followed him home. As he prepared a simple stew for dinner, Sarah sat at the table working on her letters. "Pa," she said suddenly, "do you think Lily and Mrs. Hartford are really okay in that old house?" Jenny at school said Lily was coughing so bad she couldn't recite her numbers today. Thomas stirred the pot thoughtfully. "Sometimes people need help even when they don't want to ask for it." Sarah looked up, her expression serious. "That's what Ma used to say. She said pride can keep folks hungry." "Your Ma was a wise woman," Thomas replied, his heart aching at the memory. He made a decision then. "After dinner, we're going to pack up some things." An hour later, with Sarah bundled beside him and the wagon loaded with firewood, tools, and a pot of hot stew, Thomas headed toward the Harper place. The night was clear but bitterly cold, stars glittering like ice crystals overhead. The old Harper homestead sat on a small rise a mile outside of town, once a promising farm before old Harper's health failed. As they approached, Thomas noted the thin wisp of smoke struggling from the chimney and the flickering light of what must be a meager fire within. He helped Sarah down and approached the door, suddenly conscious of how this might appear, a man calling on a widow after dark, even with innocent intentions. He knocked firmly. After a long moment, the door opened a crack, and Eleanor's face appeared, illuminated by a candle. Her eyes widened with surprise. "Mr. Fletcher? Is something amiss in town?" "No, ma'am," Thomas replied, hat in hand. "Word reached me that you might be having trouble with your chimney. This cold's nothing to trifle with, especially with little ones." Eleanor's expression tightened. "We're managing quite well, thank you." Her words were interrupted by a harsh coughing sound from within. Thomas recognized that deep, rattling cough, the kind that could turn deadly if not treated. "Mrs. Hartford," he said gently, "I've brought firewood, some tools to fix that chimney, and a hot meal." Sarah here was worried about Lily, and truth be told, so was I. "Please, let me help." As one parent to another. Something in his words seemed to reach her. Eleanor's shoulders slumped slightly, the proud facade cracking. She began, then stopped as another coughing fit echoed from inside. "Very well, Mr. Fletcher. I would be grateful for your assistance." The interior of the cabin was even worse than Thomas had imagined. The cold permeated every corner, and smoke hung in the air from the poorly functioning fireplace. Lily lay on a small cot, wrapped in blankets, her face flushed with fever. Sarah immediately went to the younger girl's side while Thomas assessed the situation. "The chimney's blocked," he explained after a quick examination. "Happens in these abandoned places, birds nest in them, then snow and debris build up." He worked efficiently, first clearing the blockage, then rebuilding the fire properly. Within half an hour, the smoke cleared and real warmth began to fill the cabin. Eleanor moved around the small space, setting out bowls for the stew Thomas had brought. "I don't know how to thank you," she said quietly as Thomas finished his repairs. "I was determined to manage on my own." Thomas washed his hands in a basin. "May I ask why you chose Timberline, Mrs. Hartford? It's not an easy place for newcomers, especially in winter." Eleanor glanced at the girls, now sitting together as Sarah read from a small book she'd brought. "My husband's business failed before his passing. The creditors took nearly everything." She straightened her shoulders. "This property belonged to a distant cousin of mine. It was all I had left, a chance to start fresh where no one knew our circumstances." "And you traveled all this way alone with Lily?" "We did what was necessary," Eleanor replied, a flash of that pride returning. "Edward, my husband, always said I was too sheltered, too dependent. I'm determined to prove I can stand on my own." Thomas nodded, understanding. "My Catherine died thinking I couldn't manage a household. Couldn't cook, couldn't mend, couldn't raise a girl proper." He smiled sadly. "Some days I think I'm still trying to prove her wrong." This confession seemed to surprise Eleanor. They fell silent as they served the hot stew to the girls. Lily's cough still sounded worrisome to Thomas's ears. "My mother had a remedy for chest coughs," he said as they watched the children eat. "Pine syrup with honey. I could bring some tomorrow, if you'd permit it." Eleanor studied him, as if trying to discern his intentions. "You've already done so much, Mr. Fletcher." "Thomas," he corrected gently. "And out here, Mrs. Hartford, we look after one another. Not out of charity, but because someday I might be the one needing help." "Eleanor," she offered in return, a slight smile softening her features. "And I would be grateful for any remedy. Lily's cough has me worried." As they prepared to leave, Sarah was reluctant to part from her new friend. "Can't we stay longer, Pa?" "Not tonight, little one. But we'll check on them tomorrow." Thomas turned to Eleanor. "The fire should last through the night now. Bank it before you sleep, and it'll keep till morning." At the door, Eleanor surprised him by touching his arm lightly. "I've been too proud, haven't I? My husband always said it would be my downfall." Thomas considered her words. "Pride keeps us standing when life tries to knock us down. But knowing when to accept help, that's wisdom, not weakness." As they drove home through the starlit night, Sarah leaned against his arm. "I like them, Pa. Lily showed me her doll collection. She has 3. Thomas smiled. Did you now? And what do you think of Mrs. Hartford? Sarah thought for a moment. She seemed scared, but trying not to show it, like when I had to recite in front of the whole school. Thomas nodded, impressed by his daughter's perception. Starting over in a strange place would frighten anyone. We should help them, Pa, like the way everyone helped us after Maya died. Thomas remembered those dark days, neighbors bringing food, taking Sarah for afternoons, men from the mill finishing the barn roof he'd abandoned in his grief. Community was the invisible thread that held frontier life together. We will, Sarah, he promised as their cabin came into view. We certainly will. That night, as wind rattled the shutters of their snug cabin, Thomas found himself thinking of Eleanor's determined face and Lily's feverish cough. Life had dealt them both difficult hands, but perhaps together, they might find a way forward, not just to survive this harsh winter, but to thrive beyond it. The following weeks brought a gradual thaw to Timberline, both in the weather and in Eleanor Hartford's reserved demeanor. Thomas made good on his promise, bringing the pine syrup remedy for Lily's cough and finding other small ways to assist without wounding Eleanor's pride. He repaired the leaking roof, showed her how to properly bank a fire for the night, and once brought a load of split firewood when he noticed her dwindling supply. For her part, Eleanor began to accept these gestures with increasing grace. Thomas observed how quickly she learned, watching his techniques, asking questions, and soon managing many tasks herself. She was no delicate flower unable to weather frontier life, just someone who needed time to adapt to its particular challenges. One crisp Saturday in early March, Thomas arrived with Sarah to find Eleanor outside the cabin, struggling with an axe nearly as tall as she was, attempting to split logs for firewood. "You're like to hurt yourself that way, ma'am," he called as they approached. Eleanor straightened, wiping her brow with a sleeve. "Then perhaps you might show me the proper technique rather than simply doing it for me?" There was no sharpness in her tone, just determination. Thomas smiled, admiring her spirit. "Fair enough." He dismounted and approached the chopping block. "It's all in the stance and the swing." "May I?" She handed him the axe, and he demonstrated the proper grip and motion, splitting a log cleanly. The axe does the work if you guide it right. It's not about strength so much as technique. Eleanor watched intently, then took the axe back. After a few awkward attempts, she managed to split a smaller log, earning a cheer from both Sarah and Lily, who were drawing hopscotch squares in a patch of dirt nearby. "Well done," Thomas nodded approvingly. "You're a quick study, Mrs. Hartford." "Eleanor," she reminded him with a small smile. "And necessity is a demanding teacher." Their conversation was interrupted by the girls running up excitedly. "Can we have our picnic now?" Sarah asked. "We've finished our hopscotch court." Thomas raised an eyebrow at Eleanor, who explained, "The girls have been planning this all week." Sarah promised to show Lily the creek now that it's thawed enough to flow again. "Indeed she did," Thomas replied. "And I believe we brought enough food to share, didn't we, Sarah?" The creek was a short walk through a stand of pines behind the cabin. The day had warmed enough to make sitting outdoors pleasant, especially in the sunshine that dappled the forest floor. As the girls explored the creek bank, collecting interesting stones and sticks, Thomas and Eleanor sat on a fallen log, sharing the simple meal they'd brought. "Lily seems fully recovered," Thomas observed, watching the child laugh as she splashed water with a stick. "Thanks in no small part to your pine syrup," Eleanor acknowledged, "and to having proper heat in that drafty cabin." She paused, gazing at the girls. "Sarah is wonderful with her. Lily never had siblings, and losing her father hit her hard. She smiled more these past weeks than in the 6 months before." Thomas nodded, understanding. Children are resilient when given half a chance. Sarah took her mother's passing hard, but having routines, responsibilities, it helps them find their footing again. "And what about their parents?" Eleanor asked softly. "What helps us find our footing?" Thomas considered the question. "Time, purpose, and eventually, I think, allowing new connections into our lives." He glanced at her, then quickly away. If you don't mind my asking, what was your husband like? Eleanor's expression grew distant. Edward was brilliant with numbers, always seeing opportunities others missed. Charming in company, ambitious to a fault. She twisted the simple gold band she still wore. Not always patient with domestic matters or with raising Lily, but he provided well until the investments failed. He sounds like a man with big dreams, Thomas offered. Too big, perhaps. When everything collapsed, he couldn't bear the shame. Her voice faltered. The doctor called it heart failure, but I think his spirit broke first. Thomas nodded solemnly. Catherine, my wife, she had a gentleness about her. Could coax flowers to grow where nothing should. Taught music to the children in town. His throat tightened with memory. The fever took her so quickly, I barely had time to say goodbye. They sat in companionable silence, each respecting the other's loss. Eventually, Eleanor spoke again. I've been offered a position, she said. Teaching at the school. It seems Miss Jenkins is expecting a child and will need to step away after the spring term. Thomas brightened at this news. That's wonderful. Were you a teacher back east? For a brief time, before I married. Her expression was contemplative. It would mean staying in Timberline permanently, making this our home. And is that something you're considering? Eleanor watched Lily, who was now helping Sarah construct a small dam of pebbles in the creek. When we first arrived, I saw this place merely as somewhere to hide from our failures, to lick our wounds. But now ... She turned to him, her expression open. I'm beginning to see possibilities here I hadn't expected. Thomas felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the spring sunshine. Timberline has a way of growing on folks once they give it a chance. It's not just the place, Eleanor said quietly, her eyes meeting his briefly before looking away. The moment was interrupted by excited shouts from the girls, who had successfully diverted a tiny rivulet of the creek. Thomas and Eleanor rose to admire their engineering feat, the conversation shifting to safer topics as they praised the children's creativity. As they walked back to the cabin later, Lily fell into step beside Thomas, while Sarah chatted animatedly with Eleanor ahead of them. Mr. Fletcher, Lily said solemnly, looking up at him with her mother's thoughtful eyes. Do you think my papa can see me from heaven? The question caught Thomas off guard. I believe he can, Miss Lily. What makes you ask? The little girl considered her words carefully. I worry he might be sad that I'm happy here, that I'm forgetting what he looked like. Thomas stopped and knelt to her level. Lily, your father would want you to be happy. And you're not forgetting him. You're just making room in your heart for new memories, alongside the ones you keep of him. Lily nodded, seemingly satisfied with this answer. Sarah says you make the best pancakes on Sunday mornings. Do you think, she hesitated, suddenly shy, do you think we could try them sometime? Thomas felt a tug at his heart. I think that could be arranged, Miss Lily. Perhaps tomorrow, if your mother permits it. When they reached the cabin, Thomas found himself reluctant to leave. The afternoon had created a sense of ease between them, all that felt precious and new. Thank you for the lovely day, Eleanor said as they prepared to depart, and for continuing to be so kind to us. It's been my pleasure, Thomas replied honestly. Then, gathering his courage, he added, I meant what I said to Lily. If you'd care to join us for Sunday breakfast tomorrow, I'd be honored to have you both. Eleanor's smile illuminated her entire face. We would like that very much, Thomas. As they rode home, Sarah chattered excitedly about showing Lily the treehouse Thomas had built behind their cabin. Thomas listened, his mind filled with the image of Eleanor's smile and the way the afternoon light had caught in her hair. Pa, Sarah said suddenly, interrupting his thoughts. I think Mrs. Hartford likes you. She looks at you the way Jenny's ma looks at her pa. Thomas felt his face warm despite the cool evening air. Does she now? And how would you feel about that, if it were true? Sarah considered the question with unusual seriousness. I think May would want us to be happy. And I like Mrs. Hartford. She taught me a new way to braid my hair today. She paused. Lily needs a pa, and Mrs. Hartford seems less sad when you're around. Thomas reached over to squeeze his daughter's hand, marveling at her wisdom. You're quite the observer, Sarah Fletcher. "So you do like her back," Sarah declared triumphantly. Thomas laughed, the sound echoing through the twilight forest. "Let's just say I'm looking forward to making pancakes in the morning." Spring arrived in Timberline with its characteristic fickleness: warm, sunny days followed by sudden snowstorms, muddy roads that froze overnight, and the constant drip of melting icicles from eaves and tree branches. Through it all, the connection between the Fletcher and Hartford households deepened. Sunday breakfasts became a tradition, alternating between Thomas's cabin and Eleanor's gradually improving homestead. Thomas found himself looking forward to these gatherings with an anticipation he hadn't felt in years. The girls had become inseparable, with Sarah taking on the role of protective older sister to Lily, teaching her the ways of frontier life with patient enthusiasm. As for Thomas and Eleanor, they moved carefully around the growing attraction between them, each respectful of the other's past and the memories they still honored. Yet with each passing week, their conversations grew longer, their shared glances more meaningful, and the accidental brushing of hands more frequent. When Eleanor officially accepted the teaching position at the school, Thomas helped her prepare by building new shelves in the classroom and repairing the wobbly teacher's desk. Working side by side, they found a comfortable rhythm, their initial wariness replaced by easy companionship. "You never told me what brought you to lumbering," Eleanor remarked one afternoon as they organized books on the newly installed shelves. "Was it a family tradition?" Thomas handed her another stack of readers. "Not exactly. My father was a blacksmith back in Pennsylvania. I apprenticed with him until I was 16, then got restless." He smiled at the memory. "Heard tell of the big trees out west, the adventure of it. Thought I'd work a season or two before heading home." "But you never did go back," Eleanor guessed. "Met Catherine that first summer. She was the preacher's daughter, far too good for a rough lumber camp boy." His expression softened. "But she saw something in me worth taking a chance on. We built a life here, plank by plank." Eleanor touched his arm lightly. "She chose well, Thomas. Any woman would be fortunate to have such a steadfast partner." Their eyes met, the implication of her words hanging between them. Thomas felt his heart quicken. Before he could respond, the schoolroom door burst open, and Sarah and Lily tumbled in, excited about a robin's nest they'd discovered in the schoolyard. The moment passed, but Thomas carried the warmth of Eleanor's words with him for days afterward. It was mid-April when disaster struck the lumber mill. Heavy spring rains had swelled the river that powered the saw blades, and despite precautions, the main water wheel broke loose from its moorings during the night. Thomas was called from his bed before dawn, arriving to find half the mill floor flooded and critical equipment damaged. For the next week, he worked from sunrise to well past sunset, organizing repairs, salvaging what machinery could be saved, and calculating how quickly they could resume operations. The mill was Timberline's economic lifeblood. Dozens of families depended on those wages. On the seventh night, exhausted beyond measure, Thomas trudged home through a gentle rain, his mind still churning with problems that needed solving. As he approached his cabin, he was surprised to see lamplight glowing from the windows. He'd left Sarah with Mrs. Wilson in town, expecting to work late again. Opening the door cautiously, he found Eleanor at his stove, stirring something that filled the cabin with a savory aroma. The table was set, a fresh loaf of bread at its center, and both Sarah and Lily were asleep on Sarah's bed across the room. "Eleanor, what's all this?" She turned, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mrs. Wilson mentioned you'd hardly eaten all week. The girls and I thought you might appreciate a hot meal that wasn't stew from the camp cook." Thomas stood speechless, overwhelmed by the simple kindness of the gesture and by how right it felt to find her in his home. "You should sit before you fall down," Eleanor added with gentle concern. "You look completely worn through." He sank into a chair, suddenly aware of every aching muscle and the bone-deep fatigue he'd been ignoring. Eleanor placed a bowl of fragrant chicken and dumplings before him, then poured coffee from the pot keeping warm at the edge of the stove. "This is ... double quotes," he began, but words failed him. "It's what neighbors do," she said simply, taking the seat across from him. "You've helped us more times than I can count." Allow me to return the favor." Thomas ate gratefully, the food restoring both body and spirit. As he finished, Eleanor refilled his coffee cup and sat beside him again. "How bad is it? At the mill?" she asked. "Could have been worse," he sighed. "We'll be operational again within a fortnight, but at reduced capacity until the new water wheel parts arrive from Denver." He rubbed his face wearily. "Some men will have to find other work temporarily. I've been trying to determine who can least afford the loss of income." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking. The school board approved funding for some improvements to the building before term starts. Perhaps some of your men could take on that work in the meantime." Thomas looked at her with newfound appreciation. "That's a fine idea. Would the board approve using the money sooner than planned?" "As the incoming teacher, I believe I could make a compelling case." Eleanor smiled. "Especially if a certain respected mill foreman supported the proposal." They spent the next hour devising plans to help the affected families, their heads bent close together over the table. When they'd outlined a workable solution, Thomas sat back, some of the weight lifting from his shoulders. "You're remarkable, Eleanor Hartford," he said softly. "I don't know how to thank you for all of this." He gestured to the cabin, the meal, the sleeping children. Eleanor's cheeks colored slightly. "Seeing you smile again is thanks enough." She began gathering the dishes, but Thomas caught her hand. "Wait," he said, his voice low. "There's something I've been wanting to say." He took a deep breath. "These past months, getting to know you and Lily, having you in our lives, it's awakened something I thought was buried with Catherine." Eleanor stood very still, her hand warm beneath his. "Thomas, I know it may be too soon," he continued. "I know we both carry our pasts with us. But I find myself looking forward, for the first time in years." He met her eyes directly. "I care for you, Eleanor, deeply. And if you need more time, or if your heart isn't ready, I understand. But I couldn't go another day without telling you." Eleanor's free hand came to rest against his cheek. "My heart has been healing in your presence, Thomas Fletcher. I wasn't looking for this for you when I came to Timberline. But sometimes life gives us second chances we never expected." Thomas stood slowly, still holding her hand. "And is this a chance you might be willing to take? Not just for now, but perhaps for always?" Eleanor's eyes shimmered with emotion. "The girls have already formed such a bond. And you and I," she drew a steadying breath. "Yes, Thomas, I believe it is." He drew her gently into his arms, and their first kiss felt like coming home after a long journey, familiar and new all at once. When they parted, both were smiling through tears. A small sound from across the room caught their attention. Lily was sitting up in bed, watching them with wide eyes. "Are you going to be my new papa?" she asked in a whisper that somehow carried perfectly in the quiet cabin. Thomas and Eleanor exchanged glances. Then Eleanor beckoned her daughter over. Lily patted across the floor and was lifted into Thomas's strong arms. "Would you like that, Miss Lily?" he asked gently. The little girl nodded solemnly. "Sarah said you might be someday. She said we could be real sisters then." Thomas's heart swelled as he looked from Lily to the still sleeping Sarah, then to Eleanor. "Well, it seems our daughters have been making plans of their own. Children often see clearly what adults complicate," Eleanor replied, her hand finding his again. Outside, the spring rain had stopped, and moonlight broke through the clouds, silvering the puddles on the path. Inside the cabin, two broken families had found a way to become whole again, not by forgetting what was lost, but by bravely building something new from the foundations of the past. As Thomas held Lily and reached for Eleanor's hand, he thought of all the seasons they would share in this small frontier town, the hardships they would face together, the joys they would celebrate, the memories they would create. Winter had given way to spring, and with it, the promise of new beginnings. "I think," he said softly, "that we all have much to look forward to.